to wildlife crime.
Many thanks. And that concludes portfolio questions, and we now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 5506 in the name of Hugh Henry on further education. I'd invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now. And Mr Henry, if you are ready, then I'd invite you to speak to and move your motion. You have 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move the motion in my name, and I first want to address the last part of that motion. Scotland's colleges have been given an exceptionally bad deal by this SNP government. They have been treated like second-class citizens compared to our universities, and it's as if their product is not as highly valued. Worse still is the contempt which has been shown to staff and to students. They were told by Mike Russell, aided and abetted by Alex Salmond, that funding was increasing when it was actually being cut. Both Mike Russell and Alex Salmond had to be dragged kicking and screaming to this Parliament to reluctantly admit that what they had been saying was not true. Had they not been forced to apologise, then they no doubt would still be insisting that college funding was increasing. What students and staff want is not just an apology. They want a recognition that these cuts are having a profound and damaging effect on college education. We are seeing courses removed and cut, and students being denied places in courses of their choice. And we have heard from SNP members in this chamber the disdain they have for many of these courses, with contemptuous remarks about hobby courses. But what's just as bad is that the idea of lifelong learning is now becoming a distant memory. This is bad news for the thousands of workers being made redundant who want to retrain in colleges and who will now struggle to find a place. College staff and students across Scotland know exactly why there is a crisis. They know why morale is at an all-time low, and it's precisely because of the budget cuts being imposed by this SNP government. Mike Russell needs to break the habit of a lifetime, and he needs to eat some humble pie. He needs to reverse the cuts to the teaching grant, not to work out some sleight of hand with money for Skills Development Scotland or some other indirect route. Give our colleges the money to deliver what they excel at. Give a boost to the students whose life chances depend on our colleges. Presiding Officer, I now turn to the main part of my motion. Now, we know that Mike Russell has a high regard for himself, and he probably thinks that the rest of us don't measure up to his high intellect. And that's why opposition members have tried to ask simple and straightforward questions about college waiting lists, hoping that the great oracle might actually give us the facts. And yet, even on this, Mike Russell could not bring himself to be straight with this Parliament. On the 23rd of October, my colleague Neil Bibby asked Mike Russell, "Are you saying that there have been no waiting lists for college places?" A fairly clear question, you might think, but no. Apparently, Mr Bibby is not equipped to ask a question on college waiting lists. Mike Russell's haughty reply was, "You have to know something about the college system before you make that assertion." Now, leaving aside the fact that Neil Bibby had made no assertion, it's clear that Mike Russell believes that only so-called experts should pose even simple questions to someone in such an exalted position. Undeterred, Neil Bibby tried again on the 24th of October. He asked Mike Russell in this chamber, "How many people are on waiting lists for college places?" And, gallantly, Liz Smith also entered the fray. She asked a direct and unambiguous question. How many people in the 16 to 19-year-old age group are on college waiting lists? So, two direct questions. And to be fair to Mike Russell, he at last answered in a very direct way and left us in no doubt that both Neil Bibby and Liz Smith were wrong. He said, "I am happy to explain again that the concept of waiting lists as presented by Neil Bibby and Liz Smith is utterly false." Well, you actually can't get clearer than that. Neither Neil Bibby nor Liz Smith had placed any wider construct on the issue. They had simply asked how many people were on waiting lists and were told that the concept of waiting lists, and I repeat Mike Russell's words, is utterly false. But given Mike Russell's track record of playing fast and loose with the facts, you can forgive my colleague Neil Findlay for wanting to nail this issue once and for all. Like Neil Bibby and Liz Smith, Neil Bibby did not suggest that Scotland's colleges figure that was issued in their press release was correct. He just wanted to make sure that he clearly understood what the Grand Panjandrum was actually saying. Neil Findlay asked, for once in a suitably humble manner, with no preamble and no prejudgment, can I ask a simple question? How many people are on college waiting lists? We are asking for a number. And the Cabinet Secretary, to be fair to him, rose to the occasion with all the authority of his office and Alex Salmond behind him. And he said, the concept that Neil Findlay raises is a false concept and a false construct. There are no waiting lists of that nature. So that's that. Waiting lists are a false concept and a false construct. There are no waiting lists of that nature. Now, I'm actually not sure what that nature actually is. I don't know what that means, because neither Neil Bibby, nor Liz Smith, nor Neil Findlay actually stated any figures. They didn't suggest that everyone who applied for a college course and was not accepted was actually on a waiting list. They merely asked a simple question. And again, to be fair to the Cabinet Secretary, he then ordered an audit to get to the bottom of the problem. The difficulty is that only 7 colleges, all in urban Scotland, were picked. The cynic might think that this was because it gave the greatest chance of showing duplicate applications to different nearby colleges. But even that shallow interim report, or the interim report of that shallow audit, issued by the Scottish Government, does point, yes, to inconsistencies and duplication. I think we should all accept that. But even that partial work has in fact confirmed that there are waiting lists in Scotland's colleges. So the officials of the Scottish Government have contradicted. The officials of the Scottish Government have contradicted their own Cabinet Secretary. The report says, Presiding Officer, analysis, and I quote, analysis of waiting lists confirmed that there is duplication of applicants. Analysis of waiting lists. That's what they said. So if there are no waiting lists, how could you have an analysis of a waiting list? And then elsewhere, follow-up analysis is continuing to clarify the status of those on waiting lists. So if there are no waiting lists, how could there be status on waiting lists for Scottish Government officials? And so it goes on in that report, reference after reference to waiting lists. Not a false concept or not a false construct, but reference to waiting lists. And so it's perfectly clear that even if the Scotland's colleges figure is incorrect, there are still students on waiting lists. In December, I submitted a Freedom of Information request to all of Scotland's colleges. I asked how many people had applied but did not receive a place. I did not mention whatsoever the words waiting lists. But unprompted, at least 7 of those colleges admitted that there were waiting lists. All of them gave details of students who were not offered places. That is the reality. Our colleges have admitted there are waiting lists. Why won't Mike Russell? So, when Neil Bibby, Liz Smith and Neil Findlay asked the question about how many people on waiting lists, the Cabinet Secretary could have said that there was duplication. He could have pointed to inconsistencies in data collection. He could have said that he would investigate and report back to the Scottish Parliament. Instead, he chose to mislead Parliament and chose to belittle those asking questions. Presiding Officer, we're often told that the way to hold the Government to account is through questions in this Parliament. But how can that be done when ministers persistently mislead and give false information to Parliament? The Cabinet Secretary clearly believes that he can say what he likes and only admits the facts when he is wrong. Surely, if this Parliament is to have any credibility, then ministers need to be open and honest. Surely, if this Parliament is to have any integrity, we cannot allow weasel words to substitute for the truth. Mike Russell owes it to this Parliament, to staff and to students in our colleges, to admit that he was wrong. He needs to admit that there are waiting lists, irrespective of how few, and he needs to apologise. We cannot allow Alex Salmond's majority to trample over what is right. This Parliament and the Scottish people deserve to be shown some respect by this SNP government.
Thank you very much. I now call on Mike Russell to speak to and move Amendment 5506.1. Cabinet Secretary, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I have been looking forward immensely to this afternoon's debate after the sudden change of subject that Labour brought about on Sunday afternoon, which was very strange timing. And I have to say, Mr Henry didn't disappoint me this afternoon with his ex-militant tendency classic analysis of the situation. I'm going to stick to the facts this afternoon, and I can understand, well, Labour may laugh now. I think that they will find the facts somewhat unpalatable. They will prove to them that I understand fully why they have brought this debate this afternoon, because they had to have this debate before the final report of the audit of so-called waiting lists is published next month. Because I suspect Mr Henry and their Conservative allies who are now sounding from their benches are becoming increasingly uneasy about what that audit will reveal. I suspect he fears, as he should fear, that it will expose as nonsense the highly exaggerated claims we have heard about the number of people who allegedly are currently waiting for a place. Now, Presiding Officer, Mr Henry is right to be concerned about what the evidence will say about his own pronouncements on this issue. And as Mr Henry looks to wriggle his way out of the spot he's got himself into, I note that his latest blog has actually stopped quoting any numbers at all. And I will say more about that in a moment. But it would be quite unfair to single out Mr Henry. He has been ably supported in this matter by Messrs Finlay and Bibby, an odd concept I know, and in particular in his quest to use internal college so-called waiting lists as some kind of measure of the numbers of Scots genuinely waiting on a college place. And in an effort not to be outdone, Liam MacArthur, the Lib Dems as opportunist as ever, has outbid even Hugh Henry's most exaggerated... No, I'm not taking interruptions because I have a lot to get through, a lot of facts to get through, and I want to finish the facts. Nor have the Conservatives, alas, been able to resist what seemed like getting a piece of the publicity action. So let's start by looking at some of the most extraordinary of the claims that have been made by Mr Henry. In the Daily Record on 11 September, Mr Henry told the world that for, and I quote, at least 10,000 Scots, the college door had been, and I quote again, slammed shut. Let's be absolutely clear what Mr Henry was telling us. He wasn't referring to students who may have been unsuccessful in gaining a place on their first choice, of course, but were then offered a place on another course. He wasn't referring to students who, as many do, make multiple applications and so appear on several so-called waiting lists. No, he was telling us that 10,000 students had the door slammed shut on them by our colleges. And in so doing, Presiding Officer, he was sending a false and deceiving message to prospective students at a time when there were places. There were places available. A few days later, on 17 September, Mr Henry turned up in the Herald, this time claiming 10,000 Scots had been turned away from colleges. That's not slamming the door shut, that's actually physically turning people away. But it wasn't enough, because by 26 October, Mr Henry was adamant that there were now 21,000 Scots who had been, and this is another ramping up of the rhetoric, denied the opportunity to improve their education. And then on his own website, he reduced the figure very shortly to 20,000, presumably in the interests of accuracy. And then Mr MacArthur, not to be outdone by Labour, came in with a figure of 21,280, although he qualified that later by saying that the number of would-be students on waiting lists, his concept, was thousands. That was nonsense. Presiding Officer, as I have said repeatedly in this chamber, colleges keep what are described as, inverted commas, waiting lists, as a way of managing their application process. as a way of managing. You see, Labour is unable, presiding officer, to learn, and that's why they repeat their mistakes. They're back here debating something. They should be ashamed of the way in which they've operated. This is a way of managing their application process and not, repeat not, in order to provide a running total of people still waiting for a place at any given moment in time. This is a fact. That is what our audit has revealed. That no, this is why the claims of 21,000 Scots, inverted commas, sat waiting for a college place is utter nonsense. Now, to tally up what are termed waiting lists in each of our colleges, and then to represent, as members have done on other sides of the chamber, that this total is the number of people currently waiting for a specific course is inappropriate, inaccurate, misleading and wrong. And it simply won't do for our opponents to claim that these are the figures produced by the college sector itself. Colleges Scotland has never claimed that the figures it has released represent the total of people awaiting a college place. Colleges Scotland has never claimed that there are no multiple entries. Colleges Scotland has never denied that people on one waiting list can end up on another course. So we are talking of false concepts. And when we are talking about apologies, any queue for an apology should be headed by Mr Henry and Mr MacArthur, and the queue should be joined by Mr Bibby and Mr Finlay, because they are the people, unfortunately, who have misled not just this chamber, but they've misled Scotland's prospective students, and that is unforgivable. And it is unforgivable, too, that Liz Smith has joined that bandwagon, a bandwagon which is now rolling very fast towards a cliff. Now, the final results of our audit will be published next month. I'd be happy to debate them again, because I believe they will confirm what I have said. This is a false concept. It has been presented by Labour, Liberal and the Conservatives to mislead Scotland and Scottish students, and it is utterly wrong in terms of what students expect. Now, presiding officer, briefly just merely mention student numbers. Hand in hand with the claims about the numbers still waiting for a college place go equally inaccurate accusations about commitment to maintaining student numbers. The fact is we are continuing to provide the funding in a way which maintains student numbers. For reasons I have explained before, headcount on its own can never be a true measure of activity in this sector where the majority of students are part-time. Headcount has always been a volatile measure capable of varying between years for reasons that have nothing to do with funding. The only way you can iron out inconsistencies between years is expressing student numbers as full-time equivalent. It is absolutely clear those are being maintained. Colleges are responding to the needs of the economy by targeting resources more intensively among students. It's right that colleges have the freedom to deliver courses in the best way. It is simply wrong to measure college activity in a way which makes no distinction between a short course of limited economic relevance compared, for example, with a year-long intensive course which delivers high-level engineering skills. Ask any employer. May I say, presiding officer, I think you are the one who tells me whether it's time up, not Mr Finlay.
It is time up, please.
I think a point worth making in case Mr Finlay thinks that he is now running this chamber. May I, in conclusion, presiding officer, say this. The neglect by previous administrations of this sector was disgraceful. It cut the benefit to learners. We are providing greater benefit to learners. Scotland deserves better than the approach that Mr Henry has taken, and I move the amendment in my name which contains the facts.
Thank you. Now call on Liz Smith.
Well, Deputy Presiding Officer, I would be inclined to give him a little more time, because the more he goes on explaining the facts in this manner, the more confused he gets. Deputy Presiding Officer, at a time when the Scottish Government has embarked upon what is a major process of tertiary educational reform, and when the provision of new educational opportunities is absolutely critical in terms of addressing the unemployment situation, it would have been very surprising indeed if colleges had not been one of the main features of Holyrood debate over recent months. However, the extraordinary frequency with which we have been debating this issue, both in full debates and at Ministers' and First Minister's questions, tells a rather different story. And that is one of a Cabinet Secretary who is having great difficulty in keeping the focus on colleges where it should be and allaying the fears of the college and university sectors about some key issues, never mind those of the public and opposition politicians. Now, Cabinet Secretary, I understand very well that different colleges are using and have been using different measures to assess the level of their waiting lists. That is not new. And it is not just because of the reasons that the Cabinet Secretary has obviously stated today about some students taking up other courses or getting a job, or perhaps not getting necessary qualifications. All perfectly valid reasons. And it's also why we should be very careful about double counting. But it also reflects the flexibility of colleges themselves, of being able to turn around these courses very quickly to adapt to the business and industry demands of their local communities, something, incidentally, which is fast becoming centre stage in the current debate about college regionalisation. But as Hugh Henry rightly said, the mistake that the Cabinet Secretary has made yet again is one of attitude. He has dismissed the perfectly legitimate questions, and I too have them here, of opposition members and, more importantly, of the college sector itself. By stating that waiting lists are a false concept, he has given a very misleading impression of the actual situation. And whilst we could no doubt spend a lot of time picking through all the semantic details, the implications, particularly as a result of the manner in which the Cabinet Secretary has spoken, were that waiting lists didn't exist, when quite clearly they do. In fact, this afternoon we've now got a new definition because you're calling them so-called waiting lists. What is at issue, of course, is the definition, just as it was the definition that was at issue when the Cabinet Secretary himself got himself tied in knots, double knots in fact, when he was pontificating about college spending. He tried to pretend then that nothing was really wrong and that it was just the opposition parties ganging up on him. Well, we are ganging up on the Cabinet Secretary. And let me say, in terms of his comment, he made it, I know how desperate members are to weigh in on this matter because they think that somehow they are going to get political advantage. That's what the Cabinet Secretary said. No, Cabinet Secretary, it is because there is very genuine concern out there, most importantly within the sector itself, that this government finds it very difficult to adopt the right approach to what is clearly a complex problem. Instead of saying that waiting lists are a false concept, would it not have been much more sensible to say, yes, they exist, explain why there are so many complexities and what the Scottish Government is doing to address them? It's the exact same thing which happened over college budgets. We heard persistent denial and again the dismissive approach that became a feature, I understand, of a Christmas YouTube at Edinburgh College, and it is not helpful to the promotion of a clear understanding of what the main issues are and what needs to be done to address them. Are we really saying, notwithstanding the current different measures which exist within individual colleges to identify the waiting list, that it is not possible to come up with an agreed definition which tells us the aggregate total of students across Scotland who, during any one time period, have made an application for a course or courses, who have the right credentials, but who cannot find a college place? Now, I don't think any of us knows whether that figure is 21,000 students or fewer, but what I do know is that it's very helpful when the Cabinet Secretary tries to dismiss the issue as though no one else has any understanding of the true situation.
I'd be grateful if you could begin to conclude.
And of course, this debate about waiting lists has just come hard on the debate about college budgets, and they are not unconnected. That is the Scottish Government's problem, and that is why we will be supporting the Labour motion.
Thank you. We now turn to the open debate. We're very tight for time. Speeches of 4 minutes. George Adam to be followed by Neil Bibby.
Once again, we find ourselves talking about further education, and in particular we hear Labour's parallel universe version of what's going on in further education, because nothing could be further from the truth from some of the information that Mr Henry has already spoke about today, Presiding Officer. Mr Henry states that college staff are demoralised. Well, if they'd listened to his contribution today, I could understand why they would be demoralised, because all we get off of Mr Henry is negativity, poison and bile presented by Mr Henry and personal attacks. Now, can I say, Mr Henry has history on personal attacks. I've known the individual presiding officer for a very long time and are aware of the personal attacks that he's done. He actually believes on discussing personality over policy and actually making a difference in people's lives. I'll gladly take the intervention.
Hugh Henry.
Would George Adam confirm that the EIS Fila branch at Reed Kerr College has passed a motion of no confidence in the Cabinet Secretary?
George Adam.
What I will say to Mr Henry is that the individual, the principal of what will be the new West of Scotland College, whatever it's be called, is actually keen on the regionalisation and the plans that we have going forward. So that is part, and they are working with the Mayor. But Labour have been found out once again attempting to make political gain with their scare tactics and their bile, and their only policies seem to be that of fear now. The audit of Scott College's waiting lists have so far found that average almost 3/4 of those on the alleged waiting list are not waiting for a college place. The 21,000 figure, often quoted by the Labour Party now, seems to be complete fantasy. Labour were warned, Presiding Officer, they were told to deal with this issue in a mature manner. Let's have the debate. We're dealing with young people's lives and people's futures. But they decided just to batter on and carry on regardless. I've said often during debates within this chamber that out with this bubble, there is a real world out there with real people and their lives. And I think they are extremely disappointed when they hear some of the debates that come from this chamber, particularly from the Labour Party, because they just believe in dealing with their issues and trying to make their personal attacks on individuals rather than discuss the whole issue that we're here to discuss. Now, the audit has so far confirmed that duplication of applicants on the alleged waiting list is there was that on the Scotland Colleges once. Majority so far appear to have actually found a college place at another college. And I was quite interested to hear Mr Henry's very scientific freedom of information request, where he went round every college and probably got similar figures to what Scotland's colleges already had, which are already found to be extremely difficult. And I will say, on the whole, Scotland's colleges, with some of the figures that they brought to the Education Committee, weren't particularly great at the best of times. But you have to ask the Labour Party, what would they do differently? Only last week, Ken McIntosh called for the full £331 million of capital spending restored to Scotland's budget in the Chancellor's autumn statement to be spent in housing, despite John Swinney saying last year that £205 million of the money would be spent, and this included £19 million earmarked for capital investment in further education and higher education.
Come to a conclusion, please.
So would Mr Henry take the money from the further education and higher education? I think we have the duplicity of the opposition here to try and get a headline instead of looking after the people we should be looking after, and that's the students of Scotland.
Thank you. Neil Bibby, to be followed by Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is unfortunate that we are here again, once again, having to debate further education in this chamber and having to challenge this government's savage cuts, which are having a devastating impact on thousands of people across Scotland, not to highlight the valuable training and retraining opportunities that colleges provide to thousands of Scots, but rather having to once more challenge this Education Secretary who continues to deny what is happening in our colleges. Given that the Education Secretary last year said college budgets were increasing, but in fact they were decreasing, it's unsurprising that he has been caught denying reality yet again. Mike Russell was asked a simple question about college waiting lists. He said it was a false concept. Presiding Officer, the only false concepts around here are Mike Russell's answers. Mike Russell disputes the figures that have been mentioned earlier. How many people are on college waiting lists? We still don't know, and the Cabinet Secretary doesn't know. But what is clear is the Scottish Government's own sample interim audit has stated that there are people in Scotland on lists waiting for college places. And if there was even any more doubt, the SNP Government's own amendment today even admits there are waiting lists. But it shouldn't be a surprise that we have college waiting lists. It shouldn't be a surprise when 1,300 staffing posts are removed from our colleges that this is where we end up. It shouldn't be a surprise when you slash colleges' teaching budgets, and it shouldn't be a surprise when student numbers have been cut by 70,000 that this is where we end up. It took Mike Russell 6 months to apologise for misleading Parliament the last time, when he falsely claimed he was cutting the college budget. How long will we have to wait for an apology this time? How can anyone have any confidence in Mike Russell when he continually misleads this chamber? But more seriously, he implements policies that continue to damage the life chances of thousands of Scots. Presiding Officer, the key thing here is to address the cause of this college waiting list scandal, the cuts to college teaching grants which should be reversed in full. We need to reinstate the money to allow those who want to train and retrain for employment to have the opportunity to do so. We need to reinstate this money to increase opportunities for young people, opportunities for women, opportunities for people with learning disabilities, and opportunities for lifelong learners. In my own region, in the west of Scotland, Reed Care College in Paisley has seen its budget cut by over £1 million. I've met with students and staff at Reed Care to discuss the damaging impact these cuts are having and the serious challenge the college faces in continuing to provide education and training. I wonder if SNP members have done the same. And the big question is, following George Adams' contribution earlier, ahead of the budget next week, will SNP backbenchers vote to cut the budgets of their local colleges yet again next week? Will, for example, George Adams, who represents so many local students, vote to cut Reed Care's budget yet again? It's time that SNP members...
Mr Adam, the member's not taking it. Mr Adam, please sit down.
Will I get extra time if I take an intervention?
I'm afraid there's no time in this debate.
It's time that the SNP members who claim to stand up for their areas and local young people to start listening to their constituents. SNP members like to talk about free education regularly, but the reality is the SNP policies here are excluding many Scots from education. Presiding Officer, in October, Mike Russell said waiting lists were a false concept. He now says they are exaggerated. The only false concepts around here are Mike Russell's answers. And the one thing now that's surely wildly exaggerated is Mike Russell's tenure as Education Minister.
You must finish
it's time
now.
he listened, apologised and dealt with his college waiting list scandal.
Call Gordon MacDonald to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Despite the Labour Party's claims about college waiting lists, it's clear from the interim audit report that it has so far found that on average almost 3/4 of those on Labour's waiting lists are no longer looking for college places. The report states in relation to the claim that 21,000 students were waiting for a college place that, and I quote, "No thank you, it was clear from discussions with Colleges Scotland that its survey results would also be subject to the factors identified in paragraph 4. That is, waiting list figures will include duplicates, individuals enrolled at college, those who do not meet entry requirements or who no longer wanted a place. As such, the College Scotland results cannot be considered a reliable measure of those waiting for college places or a reliable measure of unmet need." Unquote. Even though the Scottish Government is facing increasing cuts in its budget, they are maintaining college student support at record levels, protecting full-time equivalent student numbers at 116,000, and a further £17 million has been allocated to colleges in the 2013-14 budget. Although I must admit to finding a fall in college enrolments. Contained in the report, Review of Scotland's Colleges, Inspiring Achievement, it states that a further education vocational enrolments had fallen by 12%, or nearly 47,000 places. However, that report did not relate to 2012-13, but to the period from April 2001 to March 2005. During this period, the report highlighted that in 1 year alone, 2004-5, the last year of data, science subjects was down 14%, maths down 14% and business management down 13%. The report published in June 2007 related to the period up to March 2005 and referred to the period when the then Scottish Executive was controlled by a Labour Liberal administration. The same report also highlighted that those undertaking part-time study saw a reduction of 3%. So when the economy was buoyant, Labour were losing college places, and in a recession the Scottish Government is maintaining places. We have an ongoing youth unemployment issue, and in the current economic situation, there is a greater demand for full-time places at colleges across Scotland. We need to ensure that young people are offered high-quality courses so that they have a valued qualifications when the economy improves. The motion also refers to teaching grant cuts, and the Scottish Government has, despite Westminster making significant cuts to Scotland's budget, been able to ensure that Scotland's 41 colleges will see their teaching grant fall by no more than 8.5%.
Last minute.
Compare that to the situation in England, where the teaching grant for universities and colleges will have been slashed by a total of 80% when the current spending review announced recent cuts a further 40% by 2014-15. Meanwhile, the Scottish Government remains fully committed to the college sector and will continue to invest significantly in it, with over £500 million of programme funding in 2012-13. The Scottish Government is making record investment in the college estate, with a new City of Glasgow College, the largest ever investment in any one college ever made in Scotland, plus the new colleges in Inverness and in Kilmarnock. Then there is investment in Anniesland, Coatbridge, Dundee and Alloa colleges, all of which comes to over £400 million of capital investment. Compare that to the £86 million spent by Labour in their first term from 1999 to 2003. This record investment will improve life chances for our young people, and through opportunities for all will guarantee a place for training or education for every 16 to 19-year-old who is not in employment.
I now call Liam MacArthur to be followed by Joan McAlpine, and time is extremely tight.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This is a brief but important debate, and I congratulate Hugh Henry on bringing it to the Chamber. I also confirm that Scottish Liberal Democrats will be supporting the motion, not least as it echoes calls that we've been making for some months for the SNP Government to reverse the cut of over £34 million to college budgets next year. The case for such a rethink, I believe, is compelling and benefits from consensus at last that college funding is going down, not up. Reversing this cut also enjoys cross-party support. Indeed, despite what we may hear again from SNP members this afternoon, I suspect that in their more private moments, many accept that a budget cut on this scale undermines claims by their ministers that they are protecting the range, availability and quality of course provision in colleges across Scotland. This is certainly the message they will have got from colleges in their own constituencies and regions. It is a strong message from NUS Scotland, whose Excellent Fund Scotland's Future campaign has already elicited 27,000 emails to MSPs in a matter of weeks. And it is the message from business, which may support sector reform, but whose representatives told the Education Committee during our scrutiny of the budget that cutting college course provision and quality could harm Scotland's economic recovery. This broad-based alliance of support in support of a rethink by the Government is not one ministers can afford to ignore. Indeed, I very much hope that ministers will listen, although the self-congratulatory tone of today's amendment and the minister's speech today suggests that he is not in listening mode. This has unfortunate echoes of his assertion during the last budget process that cuts to college budgets were, quote, a full, fair and final settlement. Of course, this claim was made to look ridiculous when John Swinney agreed to provide an additional £40 million of support. But it is a concern that the Education Secretary has chosen once again to adopt such a dismissive attitude and reject any notion that aspects of what he is doing may not command support in the college sector or require to be changed. This is a feature of the hole Mr Russell created for himself over funding at the end of last year, and it is also characteristic of his behaviour in relation to what he is now dubbing so-called waiting lists. Let's consider how this issue has developed. When Colleges Scotland first published its figures in October, Mr Russell was perfectly entitled to question the basis and ask for details. It was certainly accepted that multiple applications and other factors had to be taken into account when establishing the actual level of unmet demand for college courses. On 24 October in this chamber, however, as Hugh Henry suggested, Mr Russell took his argument to an illogical extreme. Clearly annoyed at repeated requests from opposition members to simply acknowledge that waiting lists did exist and to put a figure on them, Mr Russell overstated his case. When asked by Neil Findlay how many people are on college waiting lists, he thundered that these were, quote, a false concept and a false construct. There are no waiting lists of that nature. And in answer to Hugh Henry's question, this probably falls into the context of the debate reference. Strange then that a fortnight later Mr Russell should invite the Funding Council to carry out an audit of this false concept. The initial results of the audit, not surprisingly, confirm a much lower figure, but they also make uncomfortable reading for the Education Secretary. In his determination to deny the extent of the problem, Mr Russell went so far as to deny the existence of any problem. The Funding Council don't believe this. The Chair of the Colleges Scotland doesn't believe this. Students certainly don't believe this. Deputy Presiding Officer, once again, Mr Russell's inability to resist dismissing any and every concern that is raised with him about what is happening in the college sector has landed him in hot water. On that basis, not only does he owe this chamber an apology, he owes our colleges, their staff and students an apology. Better still, he could make sure that the £34 million cut in college budgets is not a full and final settlement and is now reversed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Call Joan McAlpine to be followed by Siobhan McMahon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to start by echoing what the Minister and my fellow colleagues have said today about today's business. Despite what Labour and the other opposition parties are claiming, there are not massive waiting lists for college places, and no amount of political spin or calling for apologies from the Minister will change that. I was struck by the fact that Mr Henry appeared to me to be backtracking on the previous figures that his party have quoted, suggesting massive college waiting lists, as the Minister exposed through the quote from the Daily Record, a paper whose veracity I can account for as a columnist for that paper. Mr Henry is now saying it's not about numbers. He's shifting the goalposts a bit. And he's also questioning why the audit focused on colleges in West Central Scotland, somehow implying that they're more likely to suffer from cross-enrolment or duplication. But that wasn't the position of his colleague Drew Smith in the Chamber on the 16th of January. Mr Smith, when questioning the Cabinet Secretary, said it's been reported in the media that 936 potential students have been turned away from North Glasgow College. Stowe College says that it's turned away more than 17,000 potential students in the last 3 years. Langside College, Anniesland College, City of Glasgow College and John Wheatley College all say they could not accommodate requests, and the City of Glasgow College, which the Cabinet Secretary mentioned, says that it has 8,021 applicants on a waiting list in the past year. We now know from the interim audit that those figures are wildly exaggerated, as the Cabinet Secretary says, so suggesting that it's not about the figures, that it's about the concept, as Mr Henry seems to be doing, is just to divert from the facts. Excuse me, Presiding Officer, I've dropped my notes. It's completely misleading to suggest that each person who appears on a waiting list, as my colleagues have said, is equivalent to one person being turned away. Many successful applicants will appear on lists for other courses simply because they have made more than one application, and there are inevitably some courses that are more popular than others, meaning that applicants will not be guaranteed a place on their first choice of course. This has always been the case, but it doesn't mean that students won't thrive on alternative courses. Our college reforms will establish a stronger collaboration with employers to ensure that their needs are met and that our young people are trained for the right jobs. This has been highlighted recently in my own constituency through Skills Development Scotland. The Scottish Government are supporting Scottish Power and Dumfries and Galloway College to develop specialist training provision to meet expected demand for trained linesmen in the area arising from the planned upgrade of the national grid. Not only that, but in November last year, Scottish Power Renewables announced that they will fund courses at Dumfries and Galloway College that will allow students to gain industry-recognised qualifications to help them on their way to become wind turbine technicians. This is what's happening already through our college reforms, and we'll see more of it happening in the future. The Scottish Government recognise that colleges are key employers of employability provision. Right now, colleges are having to adapt and deliver due to a period of considerable change. The Scottish Government have responded positively to calls from the sector for stability, which we can see in the allocation of £19 million of capital funding for further education. I think that is a very impressive record indeed. There is also a further £17 million allocated to colleges. This money forms part of our £500 million plus commitment to colleges previously announced in the draft Scottish budget. On top of this, the Scottish Government have allocated £17 million in order to maintain college student support at record levels and protect the number of students in further education.
Please conclude.
The Scottish Funding Council also envisage the regionalisation reform of the college sector will reduce duplication and deliver savings of more than £500 million per year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Siobhan McMahon, to be followed by Willie Coffey.
I read with interest the exchange between Michael Russell, Neil Bibby and Les Smith in the Chamber during October last year, when Mr Russell stubbornly insisted that waiting lists are a false concept. Some people, when confronted with facts they would rather not face, have a propensity to create their own reality. If the world does not fit in their world view, the world is simply the wrong shape and must be bent and twisted until it is the right shape. In this alternative universe, Scotland gains automatic entrance to the EU. On the day after independence, all our hands flow with gold. The college budget is going up and not down, and college waiting lists are a false concept and do not exist. If only life were so simple. Sadly, for all of us in general, and Mr Russell in particular, it is not. The Scottish Government's own interim report shows that waiting lists definitely do exist. For those of us familiar with the recent Audit Scotland report on colleges, the potential extent of unmet demand is not surprising. You cannot reduce real terms college funding by 24% over 4 years and expect there not to be an impact. In attempting to explain why waiting lists are a false concept, one of the mitigating factors Mr Russell referred to is duplication. But as the interim report makes clear, duplication only accounts for 9% of the total from the 7 colleges included in the sample. Moreover, the extent to which duplication can be cited as a legitimate factor varies according to the number of colleges and the availability of courses within a specific area. Some communities are within commuting distance of several colleges, others, however, are not. While residents in North and South Lancashire have access to 4 colleges, residents in the Falkirk area only have access to Forth Valley College. It is therefore unlikely that applicants to Forth Valley will submit multiple applications to other colleges, or indeed will apply to other colleges if their application to Forth Valley proves unsuccessful. In addition to this, whilst Forth Valley College has multiple campuses at Stirling, Falkirk, Alloa and Clickmannon, some courses are only available at certain locations. For example, only the Falkirk campus offers all 3 of the business courses and all 5 of the construction courses. Civil engineering and chemical science are available only at Falkirk. The combination of limited places and awkward geography will leave failed applicants with few alternatives and many successful ones facing a lengthy commute that will add significantly to their financial burden. With youth unemployment stubbornly high and the economy still in the doldrums, we should be doing everything possible to help young people get the education and training necessary to securing long-term sustainable employment or to progress on to higher education. Well-funded and adequately resourced colleges are essential to this goal. But according to the Audit Scotland report I referred to earlier, colleges are likely to face significant financial challenges in the years ahead. The report states that this is in no small measure due to the Scottish Government's decision to drastically reduce further education funding. Meanwhile, some colleges are already under financial strain. In 2010-11, Forth Valley had the second highest operating deficit of any college in Scotland, at approximately £2.4 million, or 7.7% of its income. It also had a £6.6 million deficit to its pension reserve. As Audit Scotland has made clear, without a U-turn by the Scottish Government, things are unlikely to get any easier. Presiding Officer, whilst law degrees at prestigious universities are increasingly the preserve of a privileged few, over 20% of college entrants come from Scotland's most deprived communities. They will be the disproportionate victims of Mr Russell's assault on further education. And if this is not bad enough, yesterday we learned that in 2011-12, 490 fewer college students from deprived backgrounds received education maintenance allowance than in 2010-11. This is the grim reality, yet all we get from Mr Russell are cuts and excuses, posturing and pomposity. The Cabinet Secretary can continue creating his own reality, but those of us living in the real world are generally concerned about the cuts to college budgets, cuts leading to fewer lecturers, fewer courses, fewer places and, yes, higher waiting lists. I have therefore no hesitation in joining with my Labour colleagues in calling upon the Cabinet Secretary to put an end to this embarrassing episode by apologising unreservedly and reversing his damaging and short-sighted cuts to the further education budget.
You must finish. I now call Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. I suppose when this motion was written, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Tens of thousands of students stuck on a waiting list, maybe even 21,000. Perfect for another dig at the Scottish Government. But alas, it's yet another scare story from Labour, and when subjected to the scrutiny of audit, it falls apart at the seams. The findings of the audit so far are that nearly 75% of those on these so-called waiting lists aren't actually waiting for a place at college at all. In one college, the so-called waiting list reduced by 95% when examined a little bit more closely. Quite incredible findings, given the sensational headlines that we all saw. A combination of duplicate applications, enrolments elsewhere, or students no longer needing a place has exposed the motion for what it really is, a cheap shot at the Cabinet Secretary. Even the briefing from the NUS doesn't even mention Labour's waiting lists theory. Not a single word in their 5-page brief. Kilmarnock College also confirmed that some students who were not successful in their course of choice were referred to other courses, and no one's guaranteed their first choice, as we all are well aware. And also at Kilmarnock College, some people who applied didn't even attend for interview. Instead, they concentrate on highlighting the budget cuts imposed in Scotland as a result of Labour's incompetence when they were last in office in the UK, and recognising the efforts of the SNP in protecting student numbers in further education. The truth is, Presiding Officer, that Scotland's SNP government is getting on with the job of transforming further education. Since the SNP came to office and up to 2014-15, we will have invested £5 billion in our colleges. That's 39% more in cash terms than the equivalent period when Labour was in power. Since 2007, the SNP increased student support from £67 million to £84 million. That's up 25%. And even in this year's budget, another £17 million has been added, despite being opposed by Labour, but described as fantastic news by the NUS. Figures published this week also show that over 34,000 school and college students in Scotland continue to benefit from the education maintenance allowance. The average EMA payment to Scottish students is now £729 a year, and more students from our communities, most in need, are benefiting from this payment, which was abolished in England. In terms of the college estate, despite huge cuts to Scotland's capital budget, the SNP is spending £200 million on a new City of Glasgow college, the biggest single investment made in any college in Scotland, and £50 million each in new colleges at Inverness and in Kilmarnock, my constituency, the latter of which will provide a massive boost to us in the town. If Labour were serious about more funding on top of this for colleges, then it could have presented an alternative budget, but it didn't. Or they could have suggested allocating some of the additional £331 million capital announced last week to the colleges. But they didn't do that either. The Scottish Government did. We allocated another £19 million out of that for capital investment in colleges. Presiding Officer, when you start from the base budget of £511 million, recognised even in the NUS paper, and add the additional capital investments and NPD allocations, this amounts to over £632 million total funding for our colleges in Scotland, well up even in last year's figure of £574. I think Scotland's students and the Scottish public can be proud of the investment in our colleges, in our students and in our reforms of the sector that will meet the needs of our students and our economy in the 21st century, and I'm happy to support the Cabinet Secretary's amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. We now turn to the winding up speeches, and I call on Liz Smith. Maximum 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary was very clear that he wanted facts in this debate, so let me try my best to ensure that we produce the right ones. Firstly, colleges use different measures for their waiting lists. That is not new. That is perfectly legitimate. They do so for lots of different reasons. Secondly, there are several members in this chamber, myself included, who have asked what I think are very legitimate questions. Thirdly, instead of explaining why it is difficult to answer these questions about the nature of the waiting lists, we were told that these waiting lists were a false concept in that context. We were also told that the implication was that the rest of us don't know anything about what we're talking about. Cabinet Secretary, that is simply not true. These facts speak for themselves. This is not a debate about the actual numbers, because I don't think any of us in this chamber is in a position to come up with the relevant numbers, because we don't know what they are. What it is a debate about is the language and the manner in which this whole context has been debated. Yet again, we have a Scottish Government that makes the claim that there is a false concept out there. It is dismissive, as though the rest of us and the college sector don't know what we're talking about. Now, that is simply, plainly, not true, and it is not helpful to ensuring that the focus in this debate is on the right place. Cabinet Secretary, could I ask you, and I'll be very brief because I did quite a lot to sum up in writing other things for this, but I think there is one question that we would like answered this afternoon. What is the definition of the waiting list to which you have been referring in the audit that has been taking place? Can I repeat that we will be supporting the Labour Party motion? I'd be very grateful, Cabinet Secretary, if you could give us an answer to that question.
Thank you very much. I now call on Michael Russell. Cabinet Secretary, you have up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I don't think it's been a good debate, alas. The tone was set in a somewhat poisonous way by Mr Henry, and I regret that. I'm quite reconciled to the fact that Mr Henry doesn't like me. I'm reconciled to the fact that Mr Henry doesn't like me. Mr Finlay doesn't like me. I can live with it. I can certainly live with that. But, it is regrettable, and instead of debating the facts, that was the tone that was set. And we shouldn't be doing that. It's not pleasant for anybody to take part in this debate this afternoon, because it's simply been, particularly from the Labour benches, an unpleasant experience. I think it does, however, explain something in Scottish politics. It explains why the poll at the weekend showed that our majority in this chamber would be the same if the election was tomorrow as it was in 2011. So, if I may put it this way, the bitter together approach doesn't work. So I would suggest another approach, right? So let me, in the remorseless search for the positive, because we're never going to be friends, Mr Henry and I, but I am trying to search for the positive and try and find a way forward. I'd be happy, after the final audit is published, to discuss that audit with the opposition spokespeople. If they want to approach me, we'll have that meeting. We'll get officials into that discussion. Of course.
Hugh Henry.
As a starting point, then, can we confirm, irrespective of how few or how many, are there waiting lists in Scotland's colleges?
Cabinet Secretary.
You see, that is exactly where we started. That is exactly the type of so-called cleverness that Mr Henry thinks is politics. The reality of this matter is that the way this has been presented, by Labour particularly, but alas, aided and abetted by Tories and Lib Dems, has been wrong. They have presented false concepts, and they have tried to prove something that is untrue. Now, I regret that, but let me go back to the positive, because I want to keep trying, despite Mr Henley's intervention. If, once the audit is published, opposition lead spokespeople wish to come and discuss this with myself and my officials, the door is open to do so. And then we can address all the definitions, such as the one that Liz Smith raised, exactly what this means, what the figures means, and why it is a false concept. But why we are working very hard to make sure that young people and others in Scotland are entitled to every opportunity that we can give them. For example, the Opportunities for All guarantee is a guarantee and is being observed, and that in itself should have made opposition members a bit cautious. There have been some things in the debate that just have been extraordinary. Liam MacArthur, who said very openly in a very Liberal Democrat way that, of course, I would be entitled to question things and their figures might be questionable. Is this why Liam MacArthur published a press release that said there were 21,280 people on the list, accepted as if it was beyond peradventure that was the case? So there's been a lot of those things, but let's try and make some progress, because we won't agree on the need for college reform, though I regret that, because college reform is long overdue and has to happen. But I am very happy to sit down and discuss the detail. And, that detail is there. When we see the final audit, that detail will be even clearer than it is in the interim audit. It tells you that what took place last year was a quoting of a lot of figures that simply weren't true. And the people who were quoting those figures were the opposition spokespeople. So they should have pause for thought on this. They were dealing in false concepts. And they were telling potential students in Scotland that there were no places available to Scottish students when there were places available to Scottish students. And I do regard that, to be blunt, as unforgivable. But I'm quite prepared to forgive it if we can have a sensible conversation about how we take forward the issue of change in Scotland's colleges, because change is unavoidable in Scotland's colleges. Indeed, not only unavoidable, it's highly desirable, because that change will focus Scotland's colleges, and is focusing them now, on the economic opportunities that exist. Yes, of course.
Liz Smith.
I don't think anybody in this chamber is denying that there should be reform within tertiary education. That is an ongoing process in any case. What we're asking for is an honest debate that should focus on the right things, and that is difficult just now because of the complications and the muddle that the Scottish Government is getting into about the numbers that you claim are on waiting lists. That's the problem.
Not at all. I'm sorry, I disagree with Liz Smith entirely. This debate has been called by Labour for a political reason, right? And alas, the bitter together parties are determined to be part of it. I regret that, because this is much more important. It's important that we work with Scotland's young people and older people for colleges. We can do so, and it would be good if we sat down and tried to do so. So the invitation is open again. I make the invitation for the third time. And I would be very happy to sit down and have that conversation in a way that we could all agree where we are with this. Because I repeat, the waiting lists of that nature, and that's exactly the words I used, do not exist. Cannot be used to aggravate demand. There's no doubt about it. And I do think it's absolutely extraordinary in the course of this debate that Hugh Henry actually not only disagreed with that, well, he's entitled to disagree with it once, but he actually essentially said the audit was rigged. The accusation was rigged. That is a nonsensical accusation. The audit was neither partial nor rigged. It will produce the results, the full results, and I am open to discussion. That invitation I make. I shall be very interested to see who takes it up.
Thank you. And I call on Neil Findlay to respond to the debate. 8 minutes, please.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Before Christmas, when Mr Russell had his disastrous spell, he tried humility for a few weeks, but it would appear over Christmas that the New Year's resolution is to cast all that aside. For the last 18 months, Scotland's colleges have been under unprecedented pressure. The teaching grant's been reduced and will be reduced again this year. There have been staff losses of 1,400 in the last year. Courses have been cut across the board. Places for adults with learning disabilities have been cut by at best 34%, and in some colleges, all outreach work for this group has ceased entirely. Colleges have been forced into shotgun mergers, and new tiers of bureaucracy are being established, with powers further centralised in the hands of the Minister. College unions have been passing motions of no confidence in the Cabinet Secretary. There have been demonstrations, and in just over a year, if we count last year's campaign and this year's campaign, over 127,000 emails have been sent to members of this Parliament by students protesting about the college's policy. And if what Willie Coffey said in his contribution is correct, what are they all complaining about? Because everything's just fantastic. And next week, this Parliament will vote on the budget, a budget that proposes yet another £34 million reduction in college finance. Now, if this was at a time of economic boom, certainly, Mr Coffey.
Willie Coffey.
Will you be proposing an alternative budget then?
Mr McIntosh explained what our position was on colleges was very clearly last week.
Order.
And he proposed that we would reverse every college cut.
Order.
Now, if this was at a time of economic boom, with jobs aplenty and reducing demand for colleges, then there would be some logic to the approach. But of course that's not the situation. Unemployment is disturbingly high, and that people are desperate to train or retrain and gain an education to help them move on in life. But as we have heard in this debate, the deliberate policy of this government on colleges is denying that opportunity to a growing number of our citizens. And despite this weight of evidence exposing the policy for the disaster it is, its chief architect, the Cabinet Secretary, ploughs ahead regardless, with that toxic mix of arrogance, denial and self-delusion that we've all become so familiar with. Over the last year, we all know there's been growing concern about the extent of waiting lists in Scotland's colleges. This has come not from Mr Russell's favourite bogeymen and women, whether it be Westminster, Labour councils, not even from sound recorder-wielding principals, or maybe more accurately, former principals. No, these concerns have come from young people, NUS college unions, business leaders, but also Scotland's colleges, the very organisation trusted to bring together these institutions. In a study they carried out, it was them who carried out the study, remember, not Labour, over 21,000 people were estimated to be on waiting lists. Scotland's colleges figure, Michael, not ours, George Adam and Gordon MacDonald both said that 3/4 of those identified in the College of Scotland report are not truly on a waiting list. Well, even if we accept that, a quarter still are, George. A quarter still are. So we seem to have consensus across the chamber that waiting lists are not a false concept, and in fact, they do, in fact, exist. And even Mr Russell's own audit accepts that waiting list exists, And when you look at it, there are no quotation marks around waiting lists, as I can see it. But just like with the budget, just like with student finance, just like with jobs and courses, the Cabinet Secretary could not face up to the reality of his own policy and instead sought solace and yet more creative accountancy. So, as with the Curriculum for Excellence, he ordered an audit. And as we've heard, this in-depth, extensive audit looked not at all of Scotland's colleges, but it looked at 7 of Scotland's colleges in Glasgow, Edinburgh and Lanarkshire. Now, I have to ask, do 7 Central Belt colleges, each with other colleges, some with several colleges in close proximity to them, provide a fair representation of how the application system and waiting lists develop across Scotland? I think not. And as Siobhan McMahon explained, is it any surprise, for example, that a Lanarkshire student might apply to Coatbridge and Cumbernauld? Or, of course, an Edinburgh student might apply to a few different colleges in the city? Of course not. But let me point out my local situation at West Lothian College. 94% of applicants come from the county. There are no nearby options. So what are the figures there? Well, in 2012-13, 3,800 people applied for full-time courses, yet only how many gained access? 1,848. For part-time students in 2007-8, there were 6,390 enrolments, and this year that figure is down to 3,000, over a 50% reduction. And of course that will be repeated in colleges, similar colleges across Scotland. But colleges like this, surprise, surprise, were omitted from the audit. The Cabinet Secretary's audit took a different sample at a different time from that taken by Scotland's colleges' much larger study, yet there is no explanation as to why these 7 colleges were selected. The report is full of assertion rather than fact and focuses on one college and claims that waiting lists are in fact only 5% of the original Scotland College's estimate. The truth of this, Presiding Officer, is that this survey started with embarrassingly flawed methodology and inevitably ended up with flawed and distorted findings, findings which were grasped and championed by the Cabinet Secretary as they fitted in with his fantasy view of the world. But I'm sorry, Presiding Officer, when Mr Russell comforts himself in these figures, no one else out there in the real world believes a word of it, not Scotland's colleges, not college principals, not college staff or students, and most certainly not the thousands of applicants who have been left without a place. Mr Henry, when mentioning these things, I noticed the Cabinet Secretary nodding his head at the issue of false concepts and false constructs. Can I caution Mr Russell, the last time we saw such vigorous head gestures from him was when he was supporting his gaffer with the dodgy statistics at First Minister's question time. Now, Presiding Officer, on the 24th of October I asked the Cabinet Secretary, and people have mentioned this, and I quote, "With no preamble, no prejudgment, can I ask a simple question? How many people are on the college waiting lists? We ask for a number." The Cabinet Secretary replied, the concept Mr Finlay raises a false concept and a false construct. There are no waiting lists of that nature. Well, that nature that I was talking about was a number. Now, even in his flawed audit, there is repeated acknowledgement that waiting lists exist, so a number must exist. So, I think it is right that the Cabinet Secretary apologises for misleading Parliament once again, and not only to me, but to Mr Bibby, Mr Smith, Anne McTaggart, James Kelly, Liz Smith and others, because he accused us all of falsehoods in relation to the existence of college waiting lists. And let me ask him again, do they exist? How many people are on them? And will he at some point give us a number? A few weeks ago, Presiding Officer, we were treated to the sight of the Cabinet Secretary, let me put it charitably, being interviewed by college students at Edinburgh College. Being an enthusiastic IT user, I'm sure he applauded the initiative of the students who put the video on YouTube so their fellow students could see and hear the Cabinet Secretary share the views, his great news about his college policies. These students told it like it is on places, courses, jobs and waiting lists, yet the denial continues. You can't hide forever, Mr Russell.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on further education, and it is now time to move on to the next item of business. I'll allow a few seconds for members to change places. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 5504 in the name of Kezia Dugdale on the cost of living. Can I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Kezia Dugdale to speak to and move the motion. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before I begin, can I first of all point to my register of interests as a Co-op MSP and a member of Capital Credit Union. For many people across Scotland, today is the last day before Payday, the longest month of the year financially, which comes immediately after the most expensive. Not having enough money to pay rent, the fuel bills and food is a worry for many in January, but there are hundreds of thousands of people across Scotland who face this struggle every month, every week, the worry preying on their mind every day. Payday loan companies have exploited these pressures for profit, and as a consequence, high-interest, short-term lending was one of the fastest-growing industries of 2012, worth well over £1 billion to the UK economy. What I intend to do today, Presiding Officer, is to outline the problem and why I anticipate it will get significantly worse in 2013. I will then seek to outline what can be done to address it, in the hope that the Scottish Government will adapt some of these ideas and show some serious leadership on this issue. The rising profits of payday loan companies should come as no surprise to anyone who has been up their local high street recently. Retail units have exploded in great number, and let me give you some examples. Recently, I had half an hour between meetings in Edinburgh and took a walk down Leith Walk. Within half an hour, I managed to find 9 different payday loan outlets within a 5-minute walk around Leith. 4 payday loan shops face your eye line when you come out of Central Station in Glasgow. 3 within 5 minutes walk along Stirling's Pitt Street. As these companies don't conduct credit checks, it's easy to take out thousands of pounds in a couple of hours, literally from walking from one shop to the next. The danger is not just on our high streets. It's relentless TV and radio advertising. It's doorstop sales. It's targeted emails, online marketing. You can borrow £500 from Wonga on your mobile phone within 15 minutes without a credit check. I have one constituent who had registered on a recruitment website, jobsontheclick.net. That website had sold her details on, and she was now being bombarded by targeted emails around payday, offering her hundreds of pounds at reasonable rates. The presence is absolutely relentless, and it's interesting to note that the marketing strategy of these companies has changed in the last few months. There used to be adverts promoting life's little luxuries, a new mobile phone, another foreign holiday. Now the adverts focus on people paying their bills. That fits very much with findings of a recent Which report, which showed that most people take out payday loans for bills, for food, for fuel and emergencies. People clearly struggling to make ends meet. Your typical payday loan customer is perhaps not who you think it is, as the Citizens Advice Scotland report highlights. 75% of clients are in full-time work. The majority were men. The majority were under 35. 30%, Presiding Officer, owned their own home. This is working Scotland. It's quite frankly a scandal that families in 21st century Scotland can work a full-paid week and still live in poverty. The living wage is clearly an answer, and I say to anyone who disagrees that if work is really paying, why is it that 6 out of 10 kids that live in Scotland in poverty come from working households? I'm sorry, Mr Mason, I've got a long way to go, and I hope he'll be contributing to the debate later himself. That's where we are now, but it's about to get a lot worse. Currently, there are 125,000 people in Scotland and 1 million across the United Kingdom who are completely unbanked. Come October, many will have to get a bank account in order to access universal credit. The only thing you need to get a payday loan is a bank account. A whole new, enticing market is about to open up for payday loan companies to exploit. Combine that with the fact that benefits will move from being paid 2 weeks ahead to 4 weeks in arrears, and you've got an instant 6-week cash flow problem facing thousands of Scots. If you've read the Govan Law Centre briefing today, you'll know that there's a further problem associated with the bedroom tax. If you have an extra property in your house, and an extra bedroom in your house, and you don't want to move, you may well end up at a payday loan company to finance the difference between your rent. It's another huge market for predatory lenders to exploit. But this isn't just a problem for individuals, Presiding Officer. It's a huge issue for housing associations and local authorities, seriously worried about rent arrears. It's not just the security of their tenants, it's the credit rating of housing associations. And I would be so bold as to say some housing associations could fail as a consequence of increased rent arrears, and such a problem will fall very squarely on the Scottish Government's doorstep. So that's the problem. What can we do about it? Well, first and foremost, we need to regulate these companies. They are only here because they've been forced out of America, state by state, through legislation. My Labour and Co-op colleague Stella Creasy has been leading the charge in Westminster to cap the cost of credit and legally limit the number of roll-ups. That's where you take out one loan to pay off another. This is an important point, Presiding Officer, because the trade industry for payday loan companies will tell you that 90% of payday loans are paid off in full. Well, of course they are. That's because you're told to take out another loan to pay off the first one that you've taken out at a much larger sum at a much higher rate. Stella Creasy, along with trade unions and community groups across the country, have built a movement so strong that it's forced the UK Government to reverse its opposition to a cap on the cost of credit. I was therefore surprised to see the Tories seek to delete that commitment from their motion today. Regulation is, of course, reserved to Westminster, but debt is devolved. That's why I've set up a campaign in Scotland called Debt Busters, which seeks to do three things. The first is to take on payday loan companies street by street. The second is to promote credit unions and their capacity to offer credible alternatives. The third is to seek to change the law to improve debt relief for those who find themselves in serious trouble. I tried to give you an example of that in practice, Presiding Officer. In Craigmillar, in the east of Edinburgh, I work closely with Castle Credit Union and Link Housing Association to run a joint campaign against payday loan companies. We produced a joint leaflet and delivered it to thousands of homes across Craigmillar and Niddrie. That led to joint money advice surgeries, and we now regularly share resources around newsletters and other items such as that, working together against these companies. I know many of my colleagues are now doing similar things in their own areas. I have a long list of things that local authorities can do to crack down on payday loan companies, but I won't talk about those today, but I'd very happily share them with any members that wants to see them. I prefer to use the rest of today's debate to make two specific asks of the Scottish Government. The first is to look at a serious concept of a wealth warning on payday loans. In 2010-11, the Scottish Government spent £6.78 million on public information and marketing campaigns. That rose to £7.13 million in 2011-12. This is money spent educating us all not to eat fatty, salty foods, not to drink too much. Health warnings. If we seek to educate the public about their health, why can't we do it about their wealth? I would like to see the Scottish Government run its own Think Twice campaign about payday loans, exposing the risk, promoting the alternative, including its own core money advice services. I'm really pleased to have explicit support for that measure from the STUC and the Church of Scotland. I've raised this issue with the Minister before now, and I understand his concerns about the Government taking such direct action itself. However, I believe that if he is still willing to address the issue of payday loan companies, he could look to facilitating another organisation to take on this work, a position supported by Citizens Advice Scotland. Part of the problem is, of course, that bank short-term lending has shrunk by 20% in the last few years, creating a new market. At the very least, the Minister should get third-party organisations like Citizens Advice Scotland and the banks around a table to see if he can make this work. There is precedent for this type of approach, of course, because big energy companies fund Big Energy Week, which is hugely successful. All it needs is leadership, Mr Ewing, and you're the man to do it. The second action I'd like the Government to consider is how it supports credit unions. In the last financial year, the Government gave £1.2 million to credit unions. Much of that money was spent on business development. What we need now is help with product development. Currently, a few of the larger credit unions offer same-day payday loan services. ScotWest started it with a Fast 500 linked to their current account. Capital Credit Union have recently introduced a Swift 500. Both charge an APR of just 26%. Presiding Officer, if you were to take out a loan with Wonga today, they would charge you 4,200% for that same loan. These are great, credible, accessible and crucially affordable alternatives. But a number of small credit unions simply don't have the capacity to offer these products. What they need is a guaranteed loan fund, a sum of money for government given to credit unions for the purpose of lending. Minister may ask where this cash comes from. It could be redeployed within existing credit union funds, but it's ultimately preventative spend, because his goal is to stop people across Scotland falling into rent arrears and causing his government a problem with the debt that will create. I know the Minister has a huge respect for the work that credit unions do. He now needs to return that with the support to address the impact of payday lending and the financial pressures facing thousands of Scots. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the challenge is huge, but we are not powerless to act. With a bit of leadership and creative thinking, this Government could take on and beat legal loan sharking in this country. I hope it will rise to the challenge today.
Thank you. And I call on Fergus Ewing to speak to and move Amendment 5504.2. Minister, 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's clear there's a huge amount of interest in this motion, which has emphasised that this debate is well attended this afternoon, and the Scottish Government absolutely accepts that January can be the most difficult month financially for a great many people. We understand that it may be tempting to seek extra cash from payday lenders to deal with unexpected bills or simply to make ends meet. But we would strongly urge anyone seeking this type of loan to consider other options before obtaining this type of credit. I've been saddened to hear of many instances where, rather than helping, Presiding Officer, these loans have led to individuals becoming entrapped in a cycle of debt when they are unable to pay back the loan, and it is then rolled over, creating a new loan on which further interest is charged, and the individual's situation can spiral out of control. This is truly a contemporary development, and one which I think across all parties causes very grave concern, especially when, as has been remarked upon by Kezia Dugdale, it is relatively young people borrowing amounts over periods as short as 30 minutes, perhaps in the bookies, after the first bet has failed. This is a very serious situation, and one which concerns us all, and I hope that a cross-party approach can, broadly speaking, be taken so far as our powers are concerned in this Parliament. Now, payday lenders are part of the consumer credit sector. This law is an area reserved to Westminster, and these businesses are operating under the rules set out by the FSA and are regulated by the Office of Fair Trading. And we believe that it is these rules that must change. And we are not alone in that belief, because many countries in Europe and many states in the USA have introduced legislation to protect those consumers from severe financial difficulty. Therefore, it is the case, Presiding Officer, that there is a lot to learn from what other countries have done. There is a lot to learn from what states in the USA have done. And I hope that lessons can be learned, and there is a willingness to learn from these other countries. However, we have acted, and we have acted even in respect of these matters. I have written to the UK Minister responsible for consumer credit. I have the letters here. Protocol means I do not read out from these letters. But I have asked the UK Minister to regulate payday loans, and I've urged the UK Government to consider a cap on interest rates for high interest and payday lending. And I haven't done that lightly, nor without a great deal of thought as to the consequences, because I'm aware of the whole history of this in recent years in the House of Commons, and I've taken some time to read the deliberations there of the OFT and of the various looks at this issue. And they concluded in the former Labour government that a cap was not appropriate. I think we need to look very carefully at this again, and I urge the UK government to do that. Yes.
Neil Findlay.
Thanks very much. We all know what the situation is regards the regulation of this at Westminster, but I hope that he will address some of the issues that my colleague Kezia Dugdale raised, and the issues that Margot MacDonald and I raised when we met John Swinney about 14 months ago on this issue, and yet very little has been done within the powers that the government here has. I think that's the point that Kezia Dugdale was making.
Fergus Ewing.
I was responding to the first point that Kezia Dugdale was making, and I think I've responded to that fairly and without resorting to political partisan points. So I'm coming on to that point, although my time is running out. Presiding Officer, I have had a number of meetings with all stakeholders to drive forward the use of the powers that we've got. I very recently convened a roundtable meeting with representatives from money advice, credit unions, the payday loan industry to discuss payday loans and their impact on the people of Scotland. I've written to all payday lenders operating in Scotland to encourage them to comply with the Charter, the Good Practice Customer Charter, and will continue to monitor the behaviour of these firms. I'm told that there are 4 trade associations, and they represent 90% of the companies operating. Well, that's all well and good, but what about the 10%? What do they do? By definition, they may not be willing to, or so willing, to operate by the code. On the subject of welfare reform, I think it's plain to see that the changes and cuts that the UK Government is introducing must have, and can only have, presiding officer, a detrimental impact on the people and services in Scotland. And we are committed to doing all we can to lessen the impact of these reforms. Between 2008 and 2010, the Scottish Government invested £12 million in the Third Sector Enterprise Fund, and 30 credit unions benefited from that. We have also, of course, used some of our advertising revenue to promote practical solutions, presiding officer, to those in the most serious of debts. And Kezia Dugdale asked me to respond to this, so I will. We last year had a successful advertising campaign to promote the use of the DAS, the Debt Arrangement Scheme, which allows debtors to pay off their debts and give them that relief from the huge anxiety that is the crippling factor that debt can bring to many households throughout the land. Well, I'm just about finishing. I will give way in my closing, but I've got 40 seconds left.
I'm afraid you're in your last minute.
Yes, indeed. I apologise for that. Presiding officer, perhaps I could just say this. We recognise that being in debt is very often an horrific experience. It leads to the breakdown of families. It causes parents, very often mothers, unending worry and stress about bringing up their family. These are the most serious of issues. We have acted using the powers that we've got to change the debt law, to work with credit unions, to work with the grain, and do the very best we can. And we will be doing more, as we will announce next week in a debate on DAS. But I very much hope that this debate will focus on the positive, the practical and the constructive this afternoon, so that we can unite and do our best in Scotland for those suffering from the scourge of debt.
Many thanks. I now call on Alec Johnson to speak to and move Amendment 5504.1. Mr Johnson, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I begin by saying how welcome it is that Kezia Dugdale has brought this matter before the Parliament. And in fact, were it not for the inevitable rolling up of issues within motions, then it might have been one which we on this side could have supported. However, the unfortunate situation is that by tying the difficulties associated with payday lenders and other credit schemes together with the accusation that somehow the UK faces very difficult economic situations, but failing to recognise that these situations are in fact the ones caused by the member's own party while in government, is one that we find difficult to accept. And I do put forward evidence to suggest that the economic policies that are being administered in the United Kingdom are doing a great deal of good here in Scotland. After all, the changes in the tax base have meant that 2.2 million Scots by 2013 will be paying half as much tax. Will be paying less tax, with those with those on basic incomes who are working full time paying less than half the tax they were only a few years ago. It's also important for us to remember that there has been some significant news on the unemployment front, with a 14,000 fall on unemployment in Scotland between September and November, and even the number of youth unemployed in that quarter showing a 23,000 drop on the figure for the equivalent quarter in the previous year. Even if we look at the benefits situation, we must remember that last year in April, the UK Government ensured that there was a 5.2% across-the-board increase in benefits. So it is difficult for some to understand how this problem can be pinned on a UK Government which is doing all it can to ensure that we here in Scotland benefit from the economic opportunities which come our way. Nevertheless, I do share Kezia Dugdale's key concerns about the issue of payday lending. And that's why in our motion we point out that we do share that concern for the problems some people are having with payday lending, and welcome the action of the coalition government that they've taken so far to tackle the problems associated with high-cost credit, including giving financial regulators the power to impose restrictions on the total cost of credit, and giving the Office of Fair Trading a new power to suspend consumer credit licences immediately where there is an urgent need to protect customers. And we also note that the yes,
John Wilson.
Could Mr Johnson explain to me how many licences have been suspended and what action the OFT is taking against one particular payday loan company, which is estimated to charge 68,300% APR rates?
Alex Johnson.
We have a very serious situation, and one which we must work together to overcome. There is, in this country, a problem with credit. There is a desire to ensure that credit is available but affordable, and that's why I think it's urgent that Scotland's two governments work together hand in hand in order to deal with this problem. That's why I am delighted to hear that there is at least a correspondence between the Minister and the UK Government in order to ensure that we do have an understanding of what is required, and I hope results will accrue from that contact. Can I move on to back what Kezia Dugdale has said, particularly in relation to the need to ensure that credit is available? There is an issue, in fact a significant issue, in that credit unions are developing opportunities to support people who require short-term loans. I think there is a huge opportunity for the credit union sector in Scotland to begin to develop a more hard-headed approach to the lending of money in Scotland, so that we do produce another opportunity for people to take advantage of that facility when required. It's therefore essential that we in this Parliament and the Scottish Government take the opportunity to promote that over time. In closing, I have to say that it is disappointing that there has been a roll-up of issues in this motion, that we genuinely feel that the issues regarding credit which are contained within it are worthy of support, and I ask once again that the Minister will give a commitment that he will work with the UK Government, and I will seek all the support I can get to ensure that we have that similar response and we create a two-way dialogue for the benefit of those who are disadvantaged by this situation.
Thank you very much. We now move to open debate. 4-minute speeches. I call on John Mason to be followed by Rhoda Grant. Mr Mason.
Presiding Officer, I must admit some parts of Alec Johnson's speech, I wondered if it was a parallel universe. But anyway, I have to say I very much agree with the thrust of the motion from Kezia Dugdale and Labour. Clearly, we are in a recession, there is austerity, people on low incomes are struggling, and that's both those who are working and those who are unable to find work. Problems of debt, and especially debt with high interest, I think we all recognise are a problem. So I do welcome the fact that this subject has been brought forward. I'm just slightly disappointed our time for the debate is so short. When looking at the problem of debt, I think there are two overlapping problems. Firstly, there is too much debt right across society, and secondly, there is a specific problem for those who are struggling most to get by. It's pretty clear that the UK and many other countries have borrowed far too much, but as well as governments, so have businesses, other organisations and many individuals. And much of this has been a choice to borrow, not being forced into it. I remember my father telling me that when he had borrowed, first of all, for a car, which I guess was in the 1950s, his own father was appalled that he could be so rash as to borrow against a car. Yet now borrowing has become a normal part of life for many of us, and saving has become little more than wishful thinking. So I would suggest that we need to change the whole mindset in society that borrowing is risk-free and can be incurred without much thought. If someone has debts and income falls, they have a problem. If interest rates return to 15%, as they were when I took out my first mortgage, there is a problem. Secondly, however, we have to recognise that for some people there is no choice. It is either food or no food, electricity in the meter or not. and this is the area we are concentrating on today. Clearly, debt is already a serious problem, but it is very, very much likely to get worse in the near future with the welfare cuts coming up very soon. If people are having to borrow, hopefully to tide them over only in the short term, how can that be done more safely? The motion does make some suggestions which are to be supported. First of all, regulation of payday loan companies and presumably of other lenders, and a cap on interest rates. However, it has to be said, both are under Westminster control, and when I was down there at Westminster, there was very little sign of the Labour government making much effort in that direction. It's a bit less specific. We've had a little more in Kezia Dugdale's speech, but there's not an awful lot in the motion as to what is meant by all of this demonstrating leadership, either from central or local government. And it does seem to me that anything we can do here is very much round the edges. The real power is down south. Yes, despite the fact you didn't let me in for 10 minutes.
Fair point, and I'll be quick. Do you support the two ideas I put forward today?
Of payday loans. Right, well, I mean, advice is, I think, one area, and to try and help people, credit unions I'm just going to come on to, absolutely. Giving advice is clearly part of the answer to all this, and I do welcome the money the Scottish Government has put into that sector recently. For some people struggling with debt and dealing with dubious moneylenders, these are also the same people who are often furthest away from libraries, from the internet and other sources of information. I think we need to encourage and support Citizens Advice Bureau and similar bodies, preferably with them working together in a network. So it was disappointing when Glasgow City Council had the voluntary sector competing against each other in their tender process the other year. Yesterday, I visited Govan Law Centre for the launch of their Prevention of Homelessness report, which talks a lot about prevention. I think that is the answer. Finally, 3 points to finish with. January is a problem. Is it really still such a good idea to pay people before Christmas for their December pay? We need to encourage credit unions, but it hasn't happened so far. Why not? It has happened in Ireland and Canada. And finally, a statutory minimum wage is far too low. We need to have a proper living wage that matches the minimum wage.
Thanks very much. Now calling Rhoda Grant to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think we're all feeling the pinch today. Payday is so near but yet so far. And if we're feeling it, we can only imagine how those on much smaller incomes are faring. In committee last week, we were taking evidence on underemployment, and Citizens Advice Bureau told us a very stark case of a young couple and their children. They had come to CAB. When they came to CAB, the parents had not eaten for a number of days. The husband was working, but worked less than 25 hours a week. The family had lost their working family's tax credit because of changes to the qualifying hours. It transpired that his wages had been doing little more than covering his travel costs to and from work, and the family had lived off their working family's tax credit. That had now gone, and they had no money. If he gave up his job, they would have been penalised and would not have received any benefits. Whichever way they looked, they couldn't feed their children. What a position to be in, especially in a modern, supposedly civilised Scotland. CAB saw that they received a food parcel immediately and started working with the family. But further changes to benefits will mean that many more will find themselves in this position. And how easy it would have been for them to take a payday loan. However, it would have only made matters worse. And there are many people in this situation, and payday loans are so accessible that there must be a huge temptation to them. CAB also provided us with a briefing for today's debate, also quoting cases that actually bring to mind loan sharks much more than high street providers. While financial regulation is a reserved matter, the Scottish Government can act. As Kezia Dugdale suggested, they can provide public information discouraging people from taking those loans, and I think we should all do that by whatever means we can. But they should also maybe look at planning legislation, ensuring that planning permission is required for a change of use for a high street shop to become a payday loan outlet. This would allow councils to keep them off the high streets. The Scottish Government could also work with credit unions, helping them to finance emergency loans at affordable interest rates. Credit unions have historically been driven by the need to help with financial planning, encouraging savings and borrowing that is sustainable. However, social and economic changes means that there is a need for emergency money, and that is more often required now. We also maybe need to look at credit unions' opening hours, because due to pay freezes and underemployment, those that would most benefit from credit unions can also be in employment, and low-paying employers are probably not the most likely to allow them time off to access credit unions. We must also do more to encourage credit unions' use by the whole of society, and that would build them and make them much more sustainable for everybody. And how much better if rates and rent relief on empty properties in our high streets be given to credit unions to make them as accessible as possible, and certainly as accessible as payday loan companies. Banks also have to develop a social policy, and it's always struck me that those who have money can access cheap credit, but those who least can afford it always have had to pay more. But the interest rates charged by payday loan companies run to many thousands of %, amounts that can be breathtaking, and some members have quoted them today. But interest charged by companies who have traditionally lent to the less well-off are also much more expensive than high street banks and the like. Presiding Officer, this debate is timely because we're waiting for our first pay after Christmas, and we can all do our bit to remove the commercialisation of times such as Christmas, which lead to much greater pressure on the less well-off and can lead to hardship. But we also need to make it easier for those in desperate straits to get the help that they need, and there is much more the government can do for people in this situation.
Many thanks. And now Colin Stewart Macmillan, to be followed by Maureen Watt.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. So this certainly is an important debate today, and I congratulate Kezia Dugdale for actually bringing it forward to the Chamber. It's an issue of great concern to many individuals, families and communities all across Scotland. And certainly, judging by the turnout of MSPs here today, it's an issue of great concern to all of us. Just a shame that no Lib Dem could be bothered turning up this afternoon. However, I do actually have to ask why the motion is focusing on the role of the Scottish Government and local authorities, when also the legislation controlling interest rates rests with Westminster. Now, why actually have the Labour Party not condemned the inaction of the condemned government on the issue? And I just wonder if it's something to do with the history of the lack of action that took place in Westminster when they were last in power.
Ken McIntosh.
I only have 4 minutes, Mr McIntosh, I'm sorry. Now, usually I do take interventions, as members will be aware. Now, the power to regulate more heavily the payday loan companies and to cap the total cost of credit rests with Westminster. And we've already heard this afternoon that the Enterprise Minister has already written to the relevant UK Minister seeking greater regulation of payday loans and urging the UK Government to place a cap on interest rates for high interest and payday lending. Now, where the Scottish Government can act, it will, and certainly, as Enterprise Minister has already said today, he is already working on this. Now, as regards to action by local authorities, now we can see that the SNP administration in Dundee City Council, they're leading the way. They are banning online access to payday loans companies on their computers, including the public access ones in local libraries. Now, at the same time that they are promoting the role of the local credit union as a viable alternative to high-interest short-term lenders. And turning to welfare reform and the impact this will actually have on those reliant on benefits. In contrast to the support for welfare cuts from the Labour Party with their Cuts Commission, looking at removing free prescriptions or the concession of bus pass for 1.2 million older and disabled people in Scotland, the Scottish Government is trying to protect families with its social wage policy, freezing the council tax, a free bus pass, the free prescriptions and free personal care, all adding up to vital support for families across Scotland against the Westminster cuts. Our commitment to a social wage will deliver benefits to everyone in Scotland. Now, the Scottish Government has already shown that it will not stand by while Westminster cuts fall hardest on the poorest in Scotland. An extra £9 million was awarded to the Scottish Welfare Fund to reinstate Westminster cuts, while over £5 million is being provided for benefit advice groups to help them cope with the increasing demand for help from hard-hit families. Now, Labour members might complain about welfare reforms, but their position, unfortunately, isn't that simple. Despite what they may say in press releases, in Westminster, leading Labour MPs such as David Miliband agree with a reduction in welfare spending. Now, the only thing that is clear about the welfare reform is that a fairer welfare system can only be achieved for Scotland with independence. Now, the Scottish Government has already provided support to credit unions recognising the valuable role that they play in providing financial services to a wide range of customers. And through the Third Sector Enterprise Fund, the Scottish Government has invested £12 million between 2008 and 2010 in credit unions, including £10,000 for Dumbarton Credit Union and £63,000 for Renfrewshire Wide Credit Union. This support underlines the Scottish Government and SNP support for the credit union movement. We believe that credit unions are able to offer a viable alternative to high-interest, short-term lenders, and I would urge all members in the Chamber to promote and also support the local credit union. Now, the motion highlights the austerity programme and welfare reform from Westminster, issues which Labour prefer to see implemented on the people of Scotland, rather than actually having the people of Scotland, through this Parliament and the Scottish Government, decide on Scotland's priorities. Labour acknowledge the impact of austerity cuts and welfare reform but they won't join the SNP in campaigning for this Parliament to actually have the real powers to really deal with the situation of welfare. Now, to conclude with, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is doing what it can with the limited powers of the current constitutional settlement to mitigate the excesses of the Westminster cuts agenda. It's a shame that Labour actually can't be said about doing the same thing.
Thanks very much. Now Colin Maureen Watt, to be followed by Anne McTaggart. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased that we're having this debate at this time as people are beginning to receive their January bills, and a bit disappointed, I must say, that the time to debate this has been halved by Labour. My first reaction when I read the motion was a bit of a surprise to call for action to tackle payday loans and high interest credit, because of course the biggest impact on this can be made at Westminster. But maybe Kezia Dugdale is gradually realising that it would be much better if powers over this were devolved here, where we could take the powers on this and other things as necessary. Not at the moment, thank you. And we can help those most in need in society. Because, as others have said, Labour had 13 years in Westminster to take action on high-interest credit and payday loans when they were in power in Westminster and did nothing. And even here, why did Labour MSPs not sign Kenny Gibson's motion in the last Parliament, which was entitled Time to Curb Excessive Interest Rates? And even more recently, only 5 Labour members signed Mark MacDonald's motion on bringing forward the January pay date, as the SNP did when they were in power in Aberdeen City Council. So it would be nice to see some consistency and continuity on the Labour benches. And I wonder whether Labour's Cuts Commission would take away much of the much-needed support from families, which is so helpful in this area. I'm grateful to the CAB for their briefing, which showed that the reasons for the rise in people struggling to make it to payday, and these were because of the stagnant economy and public sector cuts, because mainstream credit is more difficult to access, and the number of people holding and using an overdraft facility or credit card has fallen by around 1 million in the UK. And the third factor, as Kezia Dugdale mentioned, was the speed at which customers can access credit without adequate scrutiny of a customer's current commitments and their ability to pay back that loan. And that, of course, has resulted in many people regretting taking out a payday loan, and they find themselves unable to pay it back and in a downward spiral of debt. And evidence does suggest that lenders are unsympathetic to customers who find themselves in financial difficulties, and it's not clear that even lenders who have signed up to the new customer charter are adhering to the good practice advised therein. I just wish that Citizens Advice Bureau and credit unions had the ability to advertise their services as much as those offering payday loans. People need to know that their first port of call should be their local credit union office, their Citizens Advice Bureau office, or even their MSP, who can direct them to the proper agency for their needs, because many organisations offer financial health checks, and they may find out that they're entitled to benefits that they've had not accessed, or that they can help them reconfigure their debt. And I noticed too that some churches are now offering this service. I'm a member of a credit union and a supporter of credit unions. I support their work in schools, but I do get the feeling that this is not the position of successive Westminster governments. And some credit unions in Scotland are getting increasingly frustrated by the lack of progress and support from south of the border, and are asking themselves why they bother belonging to cross-border organisations in this field. The credit union sector is stronger in Scotland. 1 in 20 people are members here in Scotland and 1 in 70 in Britain. Scotland is making more progress in this area, and so the natural procession, presiding officer, is for Scotland to take full control in this area. And I'm happy with this motion that Kezia Douglas is beginning to see this too.
Thanks very much. Now call on Anne McTaggart to be followed by Chick Brodie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And before I begin, I'd like to declare an interest in my membership with Scott West and Glasgow Credit Union, and also as a member of the cross-party group in credit unions. I'm delighted to contribute to this debate on the increasingly squeezed standards of living for families in Scotland, and to express my growing concern that a part of the financial industry that is responsible for the economic crash is continuing to profit from some of the most deprived people in our communities. We know that companies offering payday loans have increased their market share by over 400% in the last 3 years, and now also represent a significant presence on our high streets and towns and cities across Scotland. It is easy to understand the temptation of a cash advance and a monthly wage, particularly for those in low-paid employment with household bills that consume the majority of their earnings. However, we also know that the interest rates on these payday loans are nothing short of exploitative, with a loan of £300 over a period of 30 days costing around £100 in interest and fees alone. Clearly, payday loans don't offer Scottish families a sustainable solution to often very serious financial problems, and more needs to be done to offer viable alternatives to these questionable business practices. Families that need access to affordable credit within a short time frame have limited options and are often unaware of the provisions made by local authorities and organisations, charities in their communities, specifically designed to offer support to those in these circumstances. I believe that credit unions hold the answer. As a Glasgow MSP that is active in the credit union cross-party group, I am delighted that 1 in 5 Glaswegians are members of a credit union. In my region of Glasgow, Drumchapel Credit Union provides short-term loans to over 3,000 registered customers in the local area, with an APR of between 15 and 26%. Drumchapel Credit Union was the very first to be established in Scotland and has, for over 40 years, provided families in Drumchapel with affordable credit to meet unexpected financial demands, such as the huge rise in the cost of energy for households over the last few years. Customers are encouraged by the team of staff and volunteers to repay loans over a longer period of time in order to spread the burden and develop a financial plan that details how their monthly income meets expected outgoings, in order to ensure that in the future short-term loans are not something that should be relied on as a source of income. I call on the Scottish Government to support an increased investment in Scottish credit unions so that they can offer equivalent products to payday loans on a fair and affordable rate of interest. Presiding Officer, it is clear that the standard of living for Scottish families has been squeezed considerably, and I understand the increased financial pressure that thousands of Scots endure as a result of low wages and high unemployment. That this is why it is vital that the Scottish Government and local authorities recognise and support the invaluable work of local organisations such as credit unions, and the key role that they play in tackling disadvantage and poverty across Scotland. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Now call on Chick Brodie, after which we'll move to closing speeches.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On the 29th of May last year, I put down a motion on payday lending, supported only by a few of my own colleagues. It said measures then taken by OFT and by self-regulation would not thwart the impending crisis. I regret to say it was right, and the crisis is now upon us. However, I congratulate Kezia Dugdale on bringing the debate to the Chamber and delivering the motion with her usual passion and compassion. Last week, Presiding Officer, in the EET Committee, we took evidence on underemployment, and we heard in that session from the CAB witnesses of one honest, hard-working family with children who were having to share a tin of beans the day before payday. Yesterday, chairing the CPG on social enterprise, I heard of the dramatic increase in referrals to the Housing Association advice centres, not referrals of the unemployed, the disabled or others, but referrals, indeed, of those in work. These and other situations do not make me sad. They make me angry. And to listen to the Pontius Pilate proposal put forward by Alec Johnson, that we are not making some people slaves to the draconian and misguided fiscal, economic and benefit policies of Westminster is an absolute nonsense. They should be ashamed. Ashamed. The immediate suppression of incomes and benefits further drives people towards expensive, very expensive payday loans. Loans in some cases that are there just to pay off earlier loans. Now, while I understand the restriction imposed on the Scottish Government by the 1974 Consumer Credit Act, and while I definitely support the intents in our amendment and our aim to change the laws, I believe there may be another way in the short term to mitigate, if not expunge, the loans challenge. The users of short-term loans in some parts of the US, of Canada and Australia similarly faced issues of affordability, multiple loans, the cycle of debt caused by the creation of new loans and the rolling over of existing loans. Australia has already legislated to subvert excessive interest loans, as have some US states. In the case of Florida, they now have a situation where one can only borrow £500. There are limited transaction fees. They've banned rolling over. They've restricted loan terms to a maximum of 31 days, and that should be our objective. So some US states, parts of Canada, are using customised regulatory systems that protect customers while allowing registered payday and short-term lenders to operate profitably, but profitably within reason. There is also a solution operated by a company called Veritech, a software solution that allows customer data to be shared among lenders, so that the maximum borrowing limit of a customer is known to all lenders at any one moment in time, and so that the borrower cannot exceed their borrowing limit by hopping from one lender to another on the same day. It then allows restriction of loans, secures a no borrowing during repayment plan, and allows reasonable fee structures for responsible lending, as we should do, preferably through credit unions. So in supporting the government amendment, I would ask it to at least investigate the possibility of a partnership with credit unions and looking at the Veritech solutions or similar solutions, and so counter the ravages of open-ended, non-self-regulated lending. Then, and only then, can we dissipate our anger.
Thank you very much. We now move to closing speeches. Jamie McGregor, just over 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to close today's debate for the Scottish Conservatives. We recognise that in these challenging economic times, the cost of living is a big issue for families across Scotland, not least due to the increasing energy bills so many of us are facing. And I would agree with Kezia Dugdale, with many of the comments made by many others about the dangers of the payday lenders and loan sharks. I was slightly surprised to hear her chiding John Mason for agreeing with 2 points she'd made, and I thought that the point of debate was to try and get the opposition to agree with you. But anyway, I think she should be pleased with him. Anyway, there was criticism of the actions of the UK government from Chick Brodie, so I want to restate some hard facts for the record. In the most recent autumn statement, the UK government demonstrated support for those on low and middle incomes by increasing the income tax personal allowance by a further £235 in April 2013, taking it to £9,440. This is further real progress towards the £10,000 target, and it means another 21,000 Scots will be taken out of tax altogether, and 2.2 million Scots will get a tax cut this April. After April, a Scot working full-time... Hold on a minute. After April, a Scot working full-time on the minimum wage will see their income tax bill cut in half compared to what they were paying under Labour. And I will give way if it's short.
Thank you for taking the intervention. What will you then say to the 1,300 people, estimated 1,300 people in South Ayrshire, who are likely to become homeless after the welfare reform package takes effect in April?
Jamie McGregor.
I'm absolutely horrified that they're likely to become homeless. I mean, it may be something to do with the fact that very few homes have been built by this present government. It's the lowest. We've got the lowest house building level for about 20 years. The confidence the UK government enjoys on the international financial markets and its ability to borrow money at very low levels has helped keep UK interest rates at historically low levels, which has in turn meant lower mortgage rates and mortgage payments for Scots people, crucial to the cost of living for so many families. They're much lower than they would have been under Labour, who haven't got credible plans to get the public finances under control. And the cost of fuel has been mentioned today and remains a huge issue, especially in my region of the Highlands and Islands. Again, in the autumn statement, the UK government cancelled the 3.2 pence per litre fuel duty increase that was planned for the 1st of January 2013. This means fuel duty will have been frozen for nearly 2.5 years. It's 10p lower than it would have been if we'd been under Labour. In addition, the fuel discount scheme pilot in the Western Isles, Orkney and Shetland, has cut a litre of diesel or petrol by 5p for local consumers in these island communities. And of course, the situation has not been helped for islanders and hauliers by the Scottish Government taking RET from commercial vehicles. This will increase the cost of living for everybody there, and it made it very difficult for the hauliers, which people rely on across the Highlands and Islands. Now, this morning in the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, we heard from Sir Robert Black, former Auditor General for Scotland, concerning the value of preventative spending, which, if directed wisely, can cut costs in the future, and thus mean more money for other budgets. Clear thinking on preventative spending is a key to saving costs in the future. Reducing waste in government and local government is a good way of reducing the cost of living for everyone else, and helping to grow the economy and create more jobs and increased economic opportunities is another key way the Scottish Government can help our constituents with the cost of living. But taking substantial sums away from our colleges, removing significant amounts from the housing budget and increasing taxes on business are wrong choices. And in conclusion, I would again call on Scottish ministers to make better use of the economic tools that they have and work with the UK Government to do all they can to get the economy moving and help increase our constituents' incomes so they can make more ends meet. I support the amendment of Alex Johnson.
Thank you very much. I now call on Fergus Ewing. 7 minutes, please, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wish to return to the matter at hand, which is the issue of debt. I think this debate has been very welcome, and I thank Kezia Dugdale and the Labour Party for bringing it forward. We will be supporting their motion tonight, and I hope they will be supporting our amendment. I think people expect us to work together. The last thing people want to see in this Parliament about this topic is cheap political point scoring and a wide-ranging tour de table about all the ills of economic policies perceived and all the faults in other parties. What purpose does that serve? I bring to this debate, I guess, a fairly long experience as a solicitor before I was elected in the area of debt, and it was one of the most moving and humbling experiences of my life, because the people that came to me for help brought with them the most horrendous difficulties and problems. And it very often would be, and I've said this before in this chamber, the female in the household, usually with children, who would actually face reality first and come to me, and the overwhelming sense of worry was based on the fact not of the mother for herself, but for her children, to keep a roof on their head. These are the things we're talking about. These are the issues we're concerned about. And we're concerned, I think, particularly about those who face extreme problems. I mean, John Mason is quite correct to bring us back to the old prevailing, widely prevalent ethos, presiding officer, that I think we all recognise, that neither a lender nor a borrower be, and taking on debt was something you should not do lightly. And perhaps that wasn't such a bad ethos when one couldn't get a mortgage without saving for a long time. Indeed, if that had prevailed in the 90s and the noughties, would we have the recession we're in now? Because credit unions manage their finances like that. They don't borrow irresponsibly. They, if you like, have behaved more sensibly and prudently than many fancy banking organisations throughout the world. But the experience I had brought home to me the predicament that people face. And, of course, all of us as MSPs in our constituency surgeries will have the same experience of speaking to people who face real pressure. Bank foreclosure, the threat of losing their house, and their children finding that they have no home, and their home is disrupted. This is the cause of huge pressure, and of course, every human story is different. There's no point in generalising, because every life is different, every experience is different. But all of us have a duty to respond as we can. That's why I have sought to give a lead in giving a clear warning that payday loans offer a particular danger to people who take them up, because if they are rolled over, if they are not repaid the month they're taken out, then very rapidly they become unmanageable. I think we all agree about that. Secondly, I do, and we have supported the second point that Kezia Dugdale made, namely to use, to an extent, taxpayers' money to advertise positive solutions about debt. DAS, for example, as we did last year. Next week, I hope we will have in a debate. Well, yes, certainly I'll take it.
I'm sure we'll return to this next week, but surely the Minister is aware that a debt arrangement scheme is no use to people who have payday loan debt. It can take 3 months to establish a debt arrangement scheme. And secondly, the extent of the Government's action today has been to have said that it's written 2 letters. Surely we're going to get more from you today about what you're going to do next.
Minister.
Well, I think it's wrong to characterise matters in that way, if I may say so gently to Kezia Dugdale. Next week, we shall be bringing forward very serious measures which we've worked on for some time and which I think will show that we have not only been giving a lead, but will bring forward a remedy that will be helpful to many of those who I have described in this debate facing this precise problem. That will be done. That has been planned for a long time. Without saying any more, next week we will bring forward at the appropriate time details of the measures we propose to introduce, Presiding Officer. Secondly, we do recognise that there is a role for the Government to play in using the taxpayers' money which we are entrusted to spend prudently on advice information about the risks of taking on dangerous debts, but also the positive solutions that are out there. We have done that, I believe, in an appropriate way, and we will continue to consider appropriate measures. And thirdly, the third measure that Kezia Dugdale described was credit unions. And of course we all support credit unions. Anne McTaggart gave a very helpful contribution, I thought, about the work that she has done in that area. And other members in this debate have mentioned credit unions and the hugely important role they play. The problem they have is that they're not as accessible as the payday loan shops. And many of them, of course, are operating successfully. Many of them have far less high a public profile. It would be inappropriate for me to mention, but we all know the several ones which are doing extremely well, that are visible, that are helping a great many people. But we need to do... Yes, I certainly will.
John Wilson.
Thank Mr Ewing for giving way. Could the Minister outline how the Scottish Government will help promote smaller credit unions in areas which desperately need that facility, that don't already have that facility in place?
Mr Ewing.
Well, we will certainly continue to promote and advise people to consult a local credit union and contribute towards public information and press publicity and campaigning. And all of us, I hope, will do that jointly together. Presiding Officer, this has been a useful debate by and large. I think there is a measure of agreement. I hope that Parliament will unite this evening, or substantially unite on the way ahead. I do wish that we had the power in this Parliament to tackle the whole of the topic. I think if we had that power, I think there would be a consensus to use it, and to use it after careful thought to regulate payday loans in a way that they are not at present. I believe that very strongly and profoundly, and I urge Parliament to adopt that view when we come to the vote this evening.
Thank you very much. I now call on Ken McIntosh to wind up the debate on behalf of the Labour Party. Mr McIntosh, you have until 4:59, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I also welcome many of the contributions this afternoon. I think Opposition Day debates are usually more combative affairs, if I may put it that way, and it's quite clear there's been a strong measure of agreement across the Chamber, certainly about the extent of the problem, if not necessarily in all the contributions on what we can do about it. Many members, Presiding Officer, have asked how many Scottish families are struggling to make it to the end of January, how many already stretching to make ends meet were pushed to the edge of financial breakdown by Christmas. There will be those who received their salaries, for example, 1 or 2 weeks early in December, leaving them 6 weeks to the end of the month without an income, and there will be others for whom the rise in gas, electricity and petrol prices have been the final straw. Just this week we heard of the increasing number of families forced to rely on credit cards to pay the essentials of living. In fact, the front page of the Herald today talks about families dipping into their savings to pay for to put food on the table, to take their kids to school and to meet the mortgage payments. But how many more have been driven not out of choice but out of necessity into the avaricious arms of payday lenders? And how many more are now cutting back on those very essentials, food, heating and housing, to pay off those exorbitantly expensive short-term loans? This is the alarming reality for many families, as my colleague Rhoda Grant highlighted earlier in her comments. Presiding Officer, struggling with debt is not a new problem, and I don't want us to move away from the here and now, but many of us will have been educated and brought up with the works of people like Charles Dickens, and will be familiar with the difficulty, the misery, the hardship and the humiliation of debt. But why is it that 200 years after the birth of Dickens, we are still, with wealth all around us in this country, we are still talking about debt in those terms? And even more worryingly, why is it that the problem is currently getting worse? Can I just say, without wishing to make any personal comments on the comments of Alex Johnson and Jamie McGregor, I do feel that the Tories were in denial in today's debate. And if I could just point out that if they don't think it's a problem, in 2007, the company Wonga, one of the most notorious payday lenders, made a loss of £1.9 million. In 2012, it made a total of £6 million payday loans in the UK and a profit of over £45 million. The problem is growing and getting worse, and we need to address it. Now, Presiding Officer, there have been many contributions this afternoon which have helped describe the scale of the problem. I want to pay particular tribute, if I may, to my colleague Kezia Dugdale, who I thought painted a particularly vivid picture, not just of the problems and the hardship it causes with families, but actually came up with a number of particularly constructive suggestions about what we can do about it. Now, the most recent research from Shelter, published earlier this month, reveals that 1 in 5 Scottish families are struggling with their housing costs. But more worryingly, the number resorting to expensive payday loans to cover rent or mortgages has now risen to 3% of the population. And these figures are very much in line with other surveys of personal debt in this country. It's becoming increasingly clear we need to take action at all levels of government now. The recession, increased levels of unemployment, wages frozen, more people moving into part-time working, these have had effect on household incomes. In fact, the average household income in Scotland has declined by £1,200 in the year for which most recent figures are available. And if we add to the rise in cost of living, exorbitant rises in fuel prices, and we can see why people are driven to despair. But what appears to be turning those difficulties into what I think most of us here are agreed is a payday loans scandal is the lack of affordable borrowing, whether this is the withdrawal of credit facilities or the tightening of credit from the more mainstream institutions. And one of the most detailed analyses of the problems is provided by R3, which is the trade body for insolvency practitioners. In their personal debt snapshot, they reveal that when paying off other debt which reveals that the most important aspect in resorting to a payday loan is paying off other debt, particularly credit card loans. It's people who are already struggling with debt who are being sucked into that downward spiral of relying on short-term borrowing with ever-increasing but extortionate levels of repayment, a spiral which the Minister recognised is very difficult, from which it's very difficult to recover. And for the most part, I did agree with much of what the Minister said, but I wanted to pick up just very briefly on two remarks, because I thought it was very helpful today that we identified who's suffering here. Unfortunately, the Minister talked about people in bookies, sometimes resorting to loans, and also John Mason, in an otherwise quite useful contribution, talked about the most vulnerable being furthest away from access to the internet. And I actually don't think this is a particularly helpful way of looking at the problem, because it implies either a degree of vulnerability or, in the Minister's case, actually a hint of feckless or irresponsible behaviour. And actually, the vast majority of these people are not the poorest of the poor. We are talking about people who are working. They are often, nearly always, with a home and a mortgage. Certainly people, all of them with a bank account, and nearly all with an income of sorts. The Minister was right, there is a generational split. In fact, although the Minister said that more men take up payday loans, more women are worried about debt. But there's a generational split about who's worried about debt. And the figures amongst the young, it's the 25 to 45-year-olds who are most worried about debt. Three-quarters are anxious about their current debt, compared to only a third of those retired. And it's younger people who are turning to payday loans to rescue them from their difficulties. The other aspect, which I thought Kezia pointed out particularly well, was the fact that the situation is about, or could be about, to get much worse. The welfare benefit changes coming through almost seem designed to exacerbate the situation. The tens of thousands of Scots without bank accounts and who therefore previously could not actually access a payday loan are being forced to open one. And with a similarly enforced move to monthly budgeting, as Kezia Dugdale said, instead of getting paid their benefits 2 weeks ahead, they're getting paid 4 weeks behind. It's widely predicted that many families are going to find themselves with even more acute short-term cash flow problems. Now, yesterday, my colleague Malcolm Chisholm commented that it's the hallmark of a civilised society that we look after the most vulnerable. It's a comment I believe that most of us in this chamber would agree with. But in my darker moments, I sometimes worry that the hallmark of our supposedly sophisticated society is that we find ever more ingenious ways of extorting money from people who can least afford it. And that's what payday loan companies are doing. I simply do not accept the argument that these companies are operating legally, that they are meeting a need, that financial regulation is reserved to Westminster, and that that is the end of the matter. The very fact that the market in payday loans has increased fourfold in as many years and now runs into the billions should set alarm bells ringing at every level of government. These companies are making millions out of human misery, and we are not mere spectators watching from the sidelines. And in fact, what has been particularly helpful, certainly from my colleagues' contributions in Labour benches, has been the number of positive actions that have been identified that we can take forward now and that will make a difference. We do agree, just to make it clear to those in the SNP backbenches, we do agree that Westminster should take action. We do agree with capping interest rates. We do agree with limiting rollover of these loans, and we particularly support the work of Stella Creasy and others in Westminster. But it is simply not a matter for Westminster to deal with. And in fact, amongst all the calls, if I may make this point, amongst all the calls for powers to be brought to this Parliament to deal with it, my understanding of the Nationalist position on independence is that financial regulation remains in Westminster. So perhaps you'd like to clarify that, because that's simply my understanding. Now, members, Mr Ewing.
Fergus Ewing.
Well, I'm very happy to clarify that the SNP wishes these powers to be transferred to this Parliament. And I wonder if I can really just make a plea to Ken McIntosh. I mean, would you be willing to work with us in order to secure now, or within a short period of time, the transfer of powers to implement the measures which he himself said a moment ago that he wishes to support and to see implemented to solve the problem and to regulate payday loans in the way that he has just described?
Presiding Officer,
briefly, please.
Presiding Officer, the Minister may wish to talk to his leader on his right, just to clarify where the SNP stand on the transfer of fiscal responsibility, because my understanding is that financial regulation will remain with Westminster under the new plans. And the point is, this is an excuse for inaction rather than a reason for action. We have identified so many activities today. The members were united in the agreement about the role of credit unions. Can I ask the Minister specifically, there is a £6 million export guarantee enterprise growth fund which the Minister has identified. Why not use some of that to support credit unions? Because so far not one of them has made a successful application. We could have set up a loan guarantee fund to expand the work of credit unions. This is something, it is expensive, it may cost money, but we'd be willing to work with the government to find ways to fund that. There are so many actions the government could take. Stuart McMillan talked about, in the same point, talked about things we couldn't do, and then went on to talk about Dundee with a good example of not using their computers to access payday loan companies. We can stop the mis-selling of payday loans. We could use trading standards. We could treat it with we could use action the way that we tackle health difficulties and tackle wealth difficulties. The government has the power. They have a social advertising budget. We'll be willing, Presiding Officer, to work with them. We will be voting. We will be voting to support the SNP's amendment because we believe that there is consensus in this chamber, and we are happy to work with them to find a way forward. I look forward to the Minister's announcement next week, and I urge members to support the motion in my colleague's name.
Many thanks. And that concludes the debate on the cost of living, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of business motion 5508 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 5508. Minister.
Formally moved.
Thank you. No member has asked to speak against the motion, therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. And the question is that motion number 5508, in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick, are we agreed to? We are. The next item of business is consideration of two Parliamentary Bureau motions, and I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 5509 on referral of an SSSI.
Formally moved.
Thank you. And I would also ask you to move motion number 5510 on approval of an SSI. Thank you. And these questions on these motions will be put at decision time, to which we now come. And there are 7 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that Amendment 5506.1 in the name of Michael Russell, which seeks to amend motion number 5506 in the name of Hugh Henry, on further education, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not agreed. The Parliament, and therefore we will move to a vote, and a member should cast their vote now, please. The result of the vote on amendment number 5506.1 in the name of Michael Russell is yes 64, no 51. The amendment is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion 5506 in the name of Hugh Henry as amended on further education be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not agreed, and therefore we will move to a vote. Members should cast their vote now. The result of the vote on motion number 5506 in the name of Hugh Henry as amended is yes 64, no 51. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. The next question is that Amendment 5504.2, in the name of Fergus Ewing, which seeks to amend motion number 5504, in the name of Kezia Dugdale, on the cost of living, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not agreed, and therefore we will move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now, please. The result of the vote on amendment number 5504.2 in the name of Fergus Ewing is yes 104, no 0. There were 11 abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. The next question is that amendment 5504.1 in the name of Alex Johnson, which seeks to amend motion number 554 in the name of Kezia Dugdale on the cost of living, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we will move to vote. Members should cast their votes now, please. The result of the vote on amendment number 5504.1 in the name of Alex Johnson is yes 15, no 100. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that motion number 5504 in the name of Kezia Dugdale, as amended on the cost of living, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not agreed, and they will now move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now, please. The result of the vote on motion number 5504 in the name of Kezia Dugdale as amended is yes 100, no 15. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. The sixth question is that motion number 5509 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on referral of an SSSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion number 5510 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. And that concludes decision time, and we will now move to members' business. I would ask members who are leaving the chamber to do so quickly and quietly, please.